because seeing what it does to my accent. And I'll share my screen, although I'm guessing you both got access to the mural.
Yeah.
But I actually find sharing my screens a little bit easier with the recording, so I'll do it that way. Excellent. There we go. So we'll have a quick icebreaker because it's always good. And then we're just going to quickly run through the housekeeping because I've got to keep that in. We'll talk through the user testing, what we're doing with previously on, and that is kind of what the CMS is going to be holding and what I'm putting in there. Then I wanted to talk about data quality. We've got a few data quality things that have cropped up, and I just wanted to talk through them and get yours opinion. Dan is like, you're actually tackling data quality. It's been on my list for a long time, but there's some things that we need to work through. And then I'll catch us up with where we are with accessibility and then do some feedback. Does that sound fine? I mean, it's just us. So if you want to change it, if you want to say, hey, let's focus in on this, totally happy, I can always swing. We'll go around the room. Dr. J, use they as a pronoun. I'm from DFT. I'm essentially in as a service owner, I believe. And my favourite accessible train station is London Bridge. The newly redesigned London Bridge is wonderful and airy, so it doesn't feel busy even when it is busy, which is really good for me, being a little bit neurospicy and a little bit anxious around people still, even this late after lockdown, because all of my friends have had COVID in the last month. So I've managed to dodge it. COVID is still around. So having big airy stations actually feels really good. Dan, I'm going to go to you first because you're at the top of the alphabet.
Okay, excellent. Yes, I'm Dan Saunders. I'm a he, him. I'm from Basemap, so I guess we've fit under the software provider mantra of this. My favourite accessible train station, my local train station in Cobham isn't accessible, so that's my least favourite station in the world, I guess, for accessibility. One side it's got step-free access, but then you've got this pesky bridge you've got to go across and walk across, which isn't great for people who have limited access requirements. So I guess the one that comes to mind is probably Waterloo, my kind of termination station, which is got lots of lifts and things like that. So I guess that's probably my favourite accessible train station.
Brilliant, thank you. And Lynn.
Hello, so I'm Lynn Anderton, she, her. I'm from Transport for West Midlands and I work in the data team. So mainly dealing with bus service changes and then feeding that through for online at stop info, data integrity, and I'm the go-to person in the team for NaPTAN, creating stops and removing stops and creating metro stops, because we're having a few new metro stops soon in the West Midlands. Okay, my favourite accessible train station, because I do get the train into work from Marston Green into New Street, Birmingham New Street, and Stetchford's just had a lift put in, so I will say that one, because my local station, which is Marston Green, has a very fancy ramp that zigzags up and over to get across to the other platform. But yeah, Stetchford's just had a nice new lift put in, so
amazing. I know that there's lots of things, and this is one of the Dan, you've brought up one of the reasons that there's a lot of work to do before we can make the train station accessibility visible in NaPTAN, because it's at a platform level. And so and that's for metro stations as well. For example, there's some tube stations here. How does it go? If you're going north, where I live, I'm equidistant between Elephant and Castle and Borough. And if I want to go northbound, I go to Borough because it's step-free onto the Northern Line. If I want to go southbound, I go to Elephant and Castle because it's step-free onto the Northern Line. And it's one of those things of only one of there's 4 platforms at Elephant and Castle and only one of them is step-free. There's 2 platforms at Borough and only one of them is step-free. So it's kind of that you become really, really cued in as to all the little nuances, and we want to get that local knowledge that people get from having to climb up and down stairs all the time, from into the various systems. But that means that we need platforms, and we don't have platforms for our train stations at the moment. And we're a bit variable on our metro stations. We've uncovered that we've only got, for a lot of London, and we know that TfL are generally pretty good at chasing us. For London, we've only got one platform for most of the DLR, and we know all the DLR has two platforms. But for some reason, when they were put in, at a time when they were put in very long time ago, we only ever put in one platform. So this is part of the audit work that I'm trying to spin up as well. Very quickly, housekeeping. You can see the previous meetings on YouTube. I put them up about 2 or 3 days after we've finished the meeting and just tidy them up a little bit. You can follow us on Eventbrite and get access to all the meetings as I build them. And then there's a newsletter that goes out. I've got to write one. It'll probably go out early next week because it's going to take me a couple of days to catch up and sort a few things out. The next meeting will be about the contact form and indicator field data quality. Dan's like, yes, finally the indicator field. The contact form, I've got a proposal and I just need to sort it out. That's at the end of this month because we've now moved into August. September will be about naming conventions. There's things around naming. I've been rewriting the CMS, been rewriting the naming conventions documentation as I've been building the CMS, and that brought up a number of questions, so I'm going to bring them and I just asked people how we would do things. What I've realized is there are 148 local authorities and there's probably 148 different ways of doing something very, very similar, and just making sure everyone's in agreement as to how to do it. And then this one came up at the Travel Line Regional Board, the Travel Line National Board, whatever one, the one that covers the entirety of the country, around what does active actually mean for a stop, and what does inactive actually mean, and what does revised and deleted and all of those things. Because, again, I've got 148 ever so slightly different variations going on, and it's quite a challenge. And then we'll figure out what we're going to talk about in November. We're not going to do anything in December, and then the next will be January. January will probably be a big one on accessibility. But accessibility will be like a little thread running through all of these. We've just done, this is kind of the information that I'm going to put up on the CMS. So I've broken it into little headings. We've got the performance metrics. I haven't done July's yet. I forgot to do it this morning. I'll go and double check. We did have a small outage. If you recall, you couldn't upload for a bit. It was about 3.5 hours. We managed to stay within a 4-hour SLA without even trying. We've done a post-mortem and we've discovered there were a couple of things that we thought were in place, and because of technology changes and a few things, some alerting didn't happen, so we didn't know stuff failed until somebody manually checked. So there's a few little pieces that we're working on, but otherwise that's our first bit of downtime in a year. So we're still sitting relatively on the 5 nines, which is quite nice. Managed removal. You're on, Lynn, you're on Trapeze, aren't you? In
No.
transport. What's the
We're on Diva. Diva.
You're on Diva. You can remove stops. So if you have stops that are physically no longer in existence,
Yep.
You've torn, and I'm using the example from Manchester all the time, you've torn down your bus station, you've rebuilt it as a shopping mall and repurposed all of the bus stops, and you want to get rid of those old ghost stops. You can now do that. Just get in contact with the team and they'll set you up on the system and talk you through it. And there is now an API feed, Dan, that you can use if you need to in your systems. Just get in touch with us and we'll give you access to it. It's still in private beta, which will allow you to see all of the stops that have been removed from the system. So you've got that. what stop it is and the date. We don't store the common names and stuff like that. We just store the stop number because that's the key. That was the key to stopping anyone, the ACCO code, because that's the key to stopping anyone reusing those codes.
Could we? Why do you not store any other details as part of it? The reason for, I think, so we do lots of work. So we've got historical public transport timetables going back to 20 years or something like that. So, but they don't always have the stop associated with it.
We can go back. We've got our data retention policy. So with that number, you can go back through the historical data and grab it. You might have the information that I need. Do you remember how we had a very old system previously that used to fall down, and that we took it out in about 2021? For somehow we have managed to. Well, no, I know exactly how, because people left the account and did the things that we're supposed to do, which is remove everything from our laptops and from our drives. We have somehow managed to lose, between us and DFT, between ThoughtWorks and DFT, the records for 2017, 18, 19 and 20 from the old system. If you've got a national file on any date for those years, just let me know and I will happily we'll strip out the notes field and then we can put it in our little data store.
Yeah, I've got the .csv for every week of each of those years.
I don't need the CSV, I need the XML if you've got it, but I'll take the CSV.
I've got the CSV, I don't have the XML unfortunately, but yeah, I've got the CSV.
If you can send me the CSVs for those years, that's great. People can work with that. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It's one of those very embarrassing moments of having to admit that we were very careful, and it's just been one of those things of everyone who left or who had their laptop upgraded assumed that one of the other 5 or 6 people involved had stored it, and then when I went chasing, everyone's like, oh no, I did this, and I'm like, okay, right, we're now at number 6, because I literally thought that I had it, but I've got our test files from that era, not the old files. Fantastic. Northamptonshire is now split. The split is now in place. Northamptonshire are now supposedly looking after, and West Northamptonshire are looking after their stops in 2 separate piles. There is some overlap still. There's some 300 stops where there's a 305 stop as well. We're just waiting on everyone to settle down, and then we'll go and we'll remove those duplicate stops. Can you do mine now? Andy has put his hand up, and we'll have a look probably when he's back from leave in September or so. We'll have a look at doing the one that Andy's been waiting for years. Data retention's done. Street versus schema is just a continuing discussion, which is all of the data quality pieces that I'm talking about. And we're having fun with coaches, because there are some buses that are coaches simply because of the route that they take at the time of day that they take it. So some bus, 50 kilometres limit on bus routes means that some of the same physical vehicle is called a bus on one route and a coach on another route, which is something that is a whole new level of edge case that I now need to figure out, because it means that there is technically no difference between a bus and a coach in some places. We're just trying to figure it out. But we did remove all the 900 coach stops, and Dan, we're just trying to sort out those last remaining few. There's 27 or 28 of them with BODs, because you're not BODs and CODS, Coach Open Data Service, isn't closely tied to NaPTAN. We can get away with 6 months or so of just trying to sort those out. So I'm not. Yeah, so it shouldn't be a blocker.
There's a weird thing that's going on. So we run the NCSD at the moment, National Coach Services Database, and that's going into BODs as a Coach Open Data. And there's a bit of discussion because the source data still uses 900 stop codes from National Express. That's what the whole of their system is built upon. And so we've got a NaPTAN lookup, which looks up the 9000 code, the NaPTAN code. And so we still maintain that. And so now it's trying to work out actually you get that data changed at source, or what can be done as part of it.
Because what was happening, that's just to do a quick recap as to why we withdrew them. When we did the migration, we asked about anyone using the 900 stops and no one came forward. We gave people about 6 months of advertising that we were going to withdraw these, because it was a centrally managed set of stops that had not been updated since 2005 or 2008. And we went, these stops are so out of date and there's been no ownership. So we withdrew them completely and didn't migrate them. Now we've uncovered that National Express are still using them. What I'm trying to do is ensure that they have coach stops that are managed by the correct local authorities, because this shouldn't be held as a centrally managed set. These are stops because it's been managed as a locally managed coach stops for a lot of places. Like London manages the coach stops without using the 900 stops. Lynn, I'm sure that you have some coach stops sitting in your bus stops. And one of the other things that I want to look at, and this is possibly one of those small things that Catherine and I are trying to figure out, Catherine's our SRO, trying to figure out where I can draw the line, is trying to code up so that we've got coach only stops, bus only stops, and bus and coach stops, because they are three very different types of stops, and to let the bus operators and coach operators be able to clearly distinguish between them, because you can't currently with the coding in the system. So we're just trying to figure out how we would do that. Do we bring in a small variation? Do we take a very unused something from the schema and turn that into coach stops? How do we do that? So I'm just having a bit of a think about the minimal change that I can make that's not going to bust anyone's systems, that can allow us to identify those, especially those coach only stops, is really important, because they're the ones that are, some of them are coded 900, some of them were local stops, and they're all over the show. And it's like, if I can get them coded in one thing, yes, that's a little bit of work for people, but it's going to make it so much easier for everybody in the long run to know, I can ask my local authority to build me one of these stops here, and we know that it's for coaches. It's the service stations, I think, are the most interesting ones.
So we remove service stations generally because whilst they're put in National Express, they are done. You can't actually get on a coach at that location. As you're just saying, we're stopping here and effectively allow people to get off and stretch their legs and get a drink and so on like that. So it's retained within the coach data, but we remove that data because every time we've approached a local authority to create a NaPTAN stop, so there was no point putting a NaPTAN stop there because public transport don't really serve their a motorway service station, and so we just remove that in our data. But I think the issue you're coming across now is that the data's trying to be just transformed into XML from source without any kind of transformation, any checks done on the data, and I think that's problematic, that approach, because the way that like with rail data, you have rail data that contains junction information as a slight aside that says this goes through this junction at this time. Now, a passenger can't get on or off at that junction. It's just a signalling junction, but it's retained within the kind of national rail data. So as a data consumer and data kind of person, we know that that's not valid. So we remove it before we pass it on to an end client. I think that's the issue we have with the coach data at the moment, is we're trying to take the data at source without doing any kind of logical checks on it. Because also in the source data for National Express, you've got stops in Calais, stops in places like that, which obviously are out of our remit. And so what do you do with those?
And this is the thing, is I think this is where Tim would be quite proud of me understanding this, is that you should be able to use the NetX. There's a NaPTAN NetX version in France that would give you the stops in Calais in the right format that you could then just use and just have them, and they start with a particular set of numbers that may or may not be unique to France, but they'll be a particular set of numbers, so you could identify the stop that you have in Calais without us having to have stops in Calais. Like I've got one of the data cleanups that I've got to do, it has been doing an audit of the rail stations, because we've got the Gare du Nord. bad French, the Gare du Nord, the Gare de l'Est, all kinds of Brussels, etc., French stations within the NaPTAN UK train set. And I'm like, those are not our stations. How do we define those stations? Mind you, I'm still trying to figure out whether the Luton Dart, because this has raised its head again, is a metro, is a 940 or a 910 stop, because it depends on who looks after it. And that's been a very, very interesting and hard to answer question, because the Gatwick Express between their terminals is listed as a national rail stop when it should be a 940 stop. So there's lots of these little cleanups that I've started to identify, and just figuring out how we talk about this in a really clear, a comprehensive way, so that it's obvious for the next person who takes over this job or who does any of the central editing why this one is a 940 stop and this one is a 910 stop, and where you get that information from, because it's quite different in how you code it up. The other thing that I want to do, and Lynn, you might be happy to hear this, and this is on my longer term strategy, is to decentralize the management of the metro stops, because I think it's ridiculous, patently, that you know all about the stop. You've got to tell me and enter the wild world of the backlog of work for Jay to get me to create a stop that you are perfectly capable of creating if we give you the system. So we're having a look as to how we could do that, whether we create a little web interface so you can just go in and create it, what checks and balances would need to happen, all the permission. We're just trying to think of all of the process things so that we can give you control of your metro stations, because that would make so much more sense for everybody.
Yeah.
And
we have got some stops that we will need quite imminently.
Send them to me. Send them to naptan.nubtig. Don't CC me in, but also be aware that I read both mailboxes. So, but by sending it to the central mailbox, it means it doesn't get lost when I go on holiday. It also means somebody's chasing me about it, because I will get tied up in a 2-hour public meeting or a 2-hour travel line board or something like that, and suddenly my day's gone and I haven't had the 2 hours to sit down and create these stops, because we don't have any software for it. I have to do it by hand in the XML. Just to let you know how insane it is at the moment. We do have nice editing software for editing the XML, and I do have a lot of help from the data side of the team, but we have to do it by hand. We don't actually have any software on the central team for doing this, because it's never been deemed worth it. Because Diva, etc., are all about managing, and the central stop stuff is just like completely bonkers, because it's all different fields as well to bus stops. Anyway, it's enough moaning about my life.
Dr. Jay, just ask one thing quickly. So talking about stop types, and going back to the coach element, where you have a stop that could be coach only, could be coach and bus, could we not utilize the stop type within NaPTAN a bit more to work that out, and maybe come up with a new one, so as opposed to relying on the 9,000 codes or something like that?
That's what I want to do. That's what I'm trying to sit down and figure out. What's the least effort? Where do I put it? Because I find it what's the word I want? Patently ridiculous. Trying to think of a polite way of saying it. That Victoria Coach Station and Victoria Bus Station are literally coded with exactly, their stops are coded identically, and it's only by the name that you can tell that they're a coach and a bus station. And I'm like, that's so wrong, because and that's kind of one of those very quick logic checks. And we ran into it a little bit at Heathrow, and that's where I wanted to have a look and pilot it, and I haven't had a chance to figure out exactly what I want to change, because it's like, do I change one? Do I move to one, or do I create a new one? And it's just figuring out what I can get away with that's going to break the least amount of other people's software and create the least problem downstream. Because Lynn, what we were doing was cleaning up all the stops around Heathrow, and there's a number of stops that are coach only and a number of stops that are bus only. And then there's some private coach and bus stops that people will need to know if they're going to a hotel.
Yeah.
So they're public-ish transport. So it's kind of like, how do we code them up? And that's been some really hard thinking. So Dave Mountain and Dan, I think, have been involved with Heathrow in carefully mapping every single stop exactly where they are and getting them all in the right places. And now it's a matter of just tweaking the coding of some of them. There's also a fun one I discovered. You can't have 2 3-axle coaches sitting next to each other in the bays because they can't turn enough to get around each other. So they end up stuck. And you have to get one out the way so the other one can go away. So you've got to go 3 2 3 2. And apparently it's known by all the coach operators. And I'm like, I'm just waiting for the day when somebody makes that mistake and just causes chaos at Heathrow coaches for a couple of hours. So data quality. I want to talk about what should we focus on, because we've got a few bits that we're working on. The first one is localities not an MPTG. Now, we had a couple of examples where somebody put in some, I don't know whether they got sick of waiting for us to create them as part of the central team, or they just forgot the process, but they created some new localities. And it turns out for localities that were already in existence. So for some reason they duplicated some localities, and we didn't pick it up until some downstream people let us know that there was this conflict coming up. There were some localities that weren't in MPTG. So what we're considering is putting in a validation check that checks all of your localities, and if they're not in MPTG, it will create an error. And I just wanted to run it past people and just go, is this something that would be worth spending our time on? It's happened a couple of times, and it's kind of like a nice little catch just to stop it happening ever again. Dan, what's your thoughts on it? Would it create havoc for you?
I don't really use MPTG that much, so I don't really have a view on it at all.
Oh,
Sorry.
Lynn, MPTG.
This is where we used to have the access to edit the localities, wasn't it?
You did, and you have created. I'm not allowed to. I have my swearing card has been removed. There is an unholy chaos within MPTG because you all got to create them, but nobody told you the proper way of stacking them.
Right. Okay.
So they are they don't. Some of them do what they're supposed to do. Some of them don't. Even the best people, and I'm going to say the best people, like Andy Hull, is considered pretty good. His stuff is also a mess because he hasn't. There's a couple of misstacks, and then he hasn't stacked right at the top properly either. So you can't do what you should do is be able to dive, for example, into London, and then dive down into Elephant and Castle, and then dive down into Newington Causeway. You can't do that kind of diving down MPTG. You go London, and then I think it's Elephant and Castle, and that's about as far down as you can. You can't. There's big jumps in the hierarchies, because often there'll be an area with a village and a new build, and so you go to the area, and then you should be able to go to the village and the new build. But the village and the new build are in slightly different hierarchies.
Okay.
It's all about parents and grandparents.
Yeah. I was just going to say to you, is this about the parent and child, and because I've never really got my head to grips with that. And
yeah, and it's one of those things that is designed to make MPTG work, but it's not because people didn't know how to do it.
Yeah.
You did the best you could do with the tools and information you had. You did all the right things. We just didn't tell you how to do parents and childs. So it is wild. There are tiny little villages that are at the same level as huge cities.
So is that a big piece of work for us to look at? But
it's more for, but it's on the longer list. What we just want to do now is just ensure that nobody's taking a shortcut of putting in a locality before getting us to put it in, because it creates some data integrity issues.
What I'd say for us, Dr. J, is we're doing quite a lot of work with NX for their audio announcements.
Mm-hmm.
And if there is like new villages and stuff, or we may need to create some new localities. So is that just a case of us then getting in touch
and getting us to do it? Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sorry. It's
fine. It's just knowing. Yeah. As long as we're aware, and it could take some time, we can sort of make other people aware that there is a little bit of a delay.
Yeah, it's that. And just to be clear, one of the big things of the localities is it's very much about which high street and which post office. And this is where, and this comes up in the next piece around the naming, around how we name places, because some people have put some people are repeating the locality in parts of the name, which makes it harder when you then go to do something like Dan would do, of concatenate the fields to make the name, of going common name, locality, indicator. If you've repeated some of that, it sounds, you can't do it programmatically. You have to do everything by exception, which is really difficult.
Just on that, Dr. J, see, we're getting asked by NX to name stops, say like there's an Aldi in Stetchford, and Stetchford's the locality, so we're getting asked to rename a stop that is maybe an old pub, it's now becoming Aldi. Stetchford Aldi. But there's so many Aldis around as well. You've got to try and differentiate which Aldi it is. So that's the sort of stuff that we're getting asked now. It's And I
was just going to say, cover in naming conventions, because this is that is September, isn't it? Yes, because this is something that I know comes up a lot, and there's one just down the road from me. There's Dunton Road, which is also known as Old Kent Road Tesco's. Now, Old Kent Road Tesco's, naming it after a shop is not allowed, because the shop could change. The Old Kent Road Tesco's has been there for 20-something years. It's probably going to be, because it's one of the biggest Tesco's in the area, it's going to be there for a very long time. Dunton Road is a tiny little short street onto a semi-industrial estate. Nobody knows it as Dunton Road. Everyone knows it as the Old Kent Road Tesco's. And it becomes one of those difficult things around the naming conventions. And this is why I want a really open, honest conversation in September around how we name things and how you get that local thing. Because calling it, and I'll use the example, the Dun Cow, which was a pub, is now and then became a doctor's office and is now possibly becoming a block of flats, is right next door to the Old Kent Road Tesco's. And so at some point, I'm sure the Old Kent Road Tesco's, Dad probably has the files to tell me this, was originally called the Dun Cow. And then it changed, but nobody calls it the Dun Cow anymore. Nobody refers to it by the pub nearby. But it's those insanely old place names that hang around. And how do we, and everyone's like, oh, you can just use alternative name. But then how does your voiceover people use the alternative name in those voiceovers? Because you're trying to make it understandable in the audio announcements for people who are traveling without driving them nuts as well. Because you don't want to hear Skipton, Aldi, Skipton 3 times, because that's what would happen if you concatenate some of those fields across. And it's insane. It's insane. So I want to hold a really deep dive into those naming conventions and get a sense of where the problems are and how people are solving it, and then see if we can coalesce on a really good workaround. Because you've all found ways of making the street and the schema kind of vibe, but it's all 148 variations of it, which makes it impossible for us to programmatically do something. And if I can get you to vibe in the same way, it's gonna make it just that little bit easier. But I also don't want people to have to change thousands of names, because that's ridiculous. Which brings us on to...
Dr. J, just very quickly going back to MPTG, whilst you were just chatting about that, I had a quick look at the data. I guess my biggest issue with that data at the moment is it's just inconsistently completed.
God, please don't. This is also part of it. We gave people a form, and that form only had some of the fields on it, and then we put other fields. It's just I literally had my swearing card revoked for what I said about MPTG was slightly more than somebody expected from me, and I'm like, okay, not allowed to swear anymore at all, because it was.
What's the language CY and GD? Do you know? One of the languages, I guess CY probably Khmer, maybe. But I've got no idea.
CY is Welsh, and
ED? GD, sorry,
Gaelic.
Yeah.
I have no idea. I know CY is Welsh.
Yeah,
that's the only one I know. So, and I know Ian is English. So your guess is as good as mine as to what GD is. It's probably in the schema and null poir to both of us. And I'm about to null poir myself again because, right, some of the Welsh, due to a little bit of data corruption that happened in migrations between systems, some of the Welsh characters corrupted into funny little weird variations of characters, because plain text is not plain text, and plain text UTF-8 and UTF-64 are slightly different, and one was set to one was set to the other, and we now have a field that's got what looks to the eye like 6 blank characters. When you go into the XML, and in the CSV it looks like 6 blank characters, but when you go into the XML it's actually a whole pile of weird, it's a string of weird characters but all of them show up as blanks. There's just a whole pile of stuff going on, and we're now solving them line by line with almost. So what we wanted to do was to turn on some improved and stricter validation. So the top table, now this becomes even better, because Dave's going to notice something here. The top table is the fields, the characters that are invalid, and MPTG and NaPTAN place and common name. So common name and place name had this restriction on it. Then there was also a pile of characters that they said, maybe don't use, we'll add them in the future. This leads to some small problems. We are possibly going to exempt, and just based on some conversations from last time, slash and where's the other slash, might be exempted. Simply because we know that London used them to differentiate between stops, Elephant and Castle, London Road, Elephant Castle, New Kent Road, part of the same Elephant and Castle. The Elephant and Castle stops, you can't call them London Road and New Kent Road because that doesn't make any sense. But so they're using a / had to stop and think of which way round it was, a / to differentiate between the two halves of the name. So we're going, okay, that is really good use of it. That sounds sensible when you're having to make that kind of things. So let's allow it still in there.
They're really common slashes in American data. So it's like 42nd and 5th Street or something like that.
Because they do a lot of corners. So we're probably going to keep the slashes, but get rid of all the rest of these characters that people could potentially use as well. But what you didn't notice is the other free text fields have not had any limitations put on them. So they have commas, they have all kinds of things in them because we're not validating. So our proposal is to turn on full validation, but also do it for these various fields. The one that we might leave alone for the moment is indicator, because we can do it field by field as well. So we're going to do it crossing, street, landmark, indicator, locality name, locality short name, and locality qualify name. So these ones, the locality ones are in MPTG, and no one's ever put any quality on them. What a surprise. And these four are in NaPTAN, and there's also not been any kind of text quality put on them. So they can have any of these, and people have put them in. And this is why I occasionally get emails from somebody saying the CSV file is broken. I'm like, oh no, it's not. It's just this one person's put a comma in. It's little things like that that just drive a whole pile of data problems for everybody. So, Lynn, if we wanted to put this in for you, is there anything here that makes you go, red flag, other than the forward and backslash, which we're now understanding we can't get rid of just now?
There's nothing screaming out.
So what we'll do is when we put this in, we will document this on the new CMS, and we'll put in, these are the characters that you can't use, these are the characters, these are the fields, all the free text fields will be checked to the same level. So we can't, because what we were starting to get is the occasional craziness, especially from these corrupted Welsh fields, because they weren't fields that were being checked even for this. So there's ats and there's hashes and all kinds of things showing up in those fields. Just not through any fault of anyone, just because the UTF-8 to UTF-64, I think, translation went badly, or the other way around. I can't remember which. Cool. Finally, landmark. I want to. Lynn, do you put it in? Dan, do you use it? Lynn looks terrified.
I know that it's definitely used in our @stop system, but I don't think it's actually being used. We definitely use indicators in our @stop system, yeah. Landmark, I do see that populated for a lot of stops in our @stop system, but it's a bit of a funny one. Some of them are, some of them aren't. They'll put like the pub, like you were saying just about maybe renaming an Aldi to something else.
Yeah.
They'll put the Aldi as the landmark rather than the common name.
So what I have is I have 148 different variations of what a landmark is and could be. So I want to have a open discussion, and nobody's using it. No downstream systems, Dan, unless you're going to turn around and say, oh, actually I use it and it's really useful occasionally.
I would love to use it, but it's not there all the time. And for us, if we look at national systems, you need to have something that is consistent to rely on it. So if you build a system that relies on it and it's not there, you don't use it.
Yeah. And people have done things. Its original intention was something like to use Charing Cross, for example. This is Charing Cross Station, a light here for the National Gallery and the National Portrait Gallery is what it consistently says. And those were the idea of landmarks, I think, from a London-centric point of view. I don't think anyone explained that very well. So there are some landmarks that are literally, it's opposite the hill, because there's only one hill in the village. Or it's opposite this particular church, if the church is not part of the name, or it's near the village hall, or something like that, which are great, but they don't have quite the same, they're not a landmark, but they might be a local landmark. And it's like, so how did we define this? What are we actually using for it? And should we fill it out? And I believe at some points it is part of one of the legislations that it needs to be filled out. So some people have put real effort into it, and I've seen real effort on a lot of local authorities to fill this out and be really clear. And some people are just like, meh, across the road. So it's kind of like, I want us to do that coalescing around what a good landmark is, what we want to do with it, and get enough agreement that we can start to tweak it up so Dan can plan eventually in some year to look at building landmark across, even if it's still a bit patchy because Midlothian will never talk to us. You'll at least know the places where it's been done well, and can use it from there. Is there anything else data quality that's bugging anybody? Cool. So I'm going to quickly run through where we are with the private beta on accessibility, because Lynn, you might have some data that's going to help us as we move along. So we decided to focus on bus stops because they're 97% of the NaPTAN data currently. There's no problems with mapping down to platform level because a bus stop is a bus stop. They cover the first and last mile of any journey, pretty much for most people. And there are many areas where bus is the only transport. And then we've based our personas on interviews with users, being informed both by Sen and the Atkins work. And what we're doing is we're ensuring that we're backwardsly compatible with these standards. If we advance, there's a very clear linkage between what we're doing and what has come through these two other standards. We're working with wheelchair users or people who have mobility access needs who are using a wheelchair, to use the very long term for it, because bus operators report on the accessibility of their buses for wheelchair, and that's the one accessibility field in the BODs. In the Trans Exchange, so we can start to kind of put that together for people and build them an accessible route, because you need an accessible stop and an accessible transport calling it that stop to have an accessible journey. If one or t'other is missing, you're not going to be able to be accessible. Essentially, Beryl can travel to see Beverly, Brenda can't, and there's an entire plan behind the reasons, which I've gone through a couple of times. What the outcome we want to create, which sounds so simple: Brenda can plan her journey using a travel planner. She'll be able to view the accessibility information in the travel planner and the information is consistent between modes, operators, and local authorities. So when she sees mobility wheelchair user, she can go, I know that this stop is okay for me to use, and it's got what I need at it. So where have we got? Our private beta was all about getting a limited journey into the system. She'll be able to view accessibility for a limited number of stops and ATCO codes, and the information might change without notice because we're tweaking and figuring out exactly what the information should be with our user researchers who are talking to various people. So we're talking to people who have visibility access needs, who are blind using or visually impaired using either a cane or a guide dog, because they're very slightly different in some of their needs. We're just trying to figure that out. And also talking to wheelchair users, both manual and electric wheelchair users, but also people who walk with sticks and have limited mobility in other ways, and just looking at how we do that. And one of the reasons for pointing this out is we're using a social model of disability rather than a medicalized model of disability. So it's, if I'm walking with a stick and I can't use the station, it's not my fault, it's the station's fault. It's society's fault that it is not providing an accessible space. It's not it's a larger problem than just that person, and it stops us looking at people and typing people who might have multiple access needs, just typing them by one type. It also is trying to stop us doing things like elderly or something like that for a user type. I know an elderly person who was 96 and was still doing Pilates every day. So it's quite, those things are variable. So that's a lot of how we're thinking about things. So where have we got into? So the green with the black is the stuff that we're working on. The green with the white text is the stuff we've completed. So we had a hypothesis that the trunk stops, or the busiest stops in in a local authority were more likely to be accessible than the less busy stops. Because the busy stops, you're likely to have spent some of your BSIP and BSOG money on making the stops better. It sounds so simple, but we've actually been able to prove it. And we can see that by looking at the frequency of buses, which means that we can sort the trunk and the branch. We've created a data pipeline for ingesting, holding, inferring, and publishing the accessibility data as APIs in various formats. Now, we've got it currently just as a JSON. We are then looking at creating an XML, a CSV, a GraphQL, and an RSS, as well as a webhook. So we're doing every single type. Dan's like, oh my God, you've covered every single type of API. And it's like, yeah, because what we wanted to do and do this across NaPTAN is ensure that NaPTAN is never the hold up to innovation. So if anyone wants a particular type of API, it's sitting there ready for them to go with enough information that they can start using it and then trying to pull apart the data. So getting hold of the data and having to translate it from XML and things like that, yes, you're still going to need to understand the data, but you'll be able to get it in a number of different ways. We've created a CMS. When I get a chance to finish off and spell check a page, we'll be able to turn on one of the first pages, and we're going to start pushing out all of the different pieces of information there. And then we'll also publish the accessibility schemas, and I'll cover the schema in a moment to show you what we're putting together, so that if there's more than one, people can see what the differences will be between the schema and how we're coding up the information that we're presenting to the downstream users, which means that Lynn and other people running local authorities can get an idea of how their data is being inferred into accessibility data.
Dr. Jay, just ask a question. So obviously you're setting up the framework to consume and supply this data externally. Who's going to be updating the accessibility information? So is it you're going to be inferring some of it? So you're going to model some of it, but is it ultimately going to be the local authorities that will need to maintain and audit their data, basically?
Yeah, it's going to be the local authorities, but the local authorities will be able to give us the street furniture information, not the accessibility information. So we're taking the street furniture information, and from that we're able to infer accessibility through different lenses. So it means that Lynn doesn't need to go, oh, is this accessible or not? We just need to know what's at that stop, and we keep the inferences central. And that was one of the big constraints that we put on ourselves, because what we didn't want was to have all the local authorities doing the inferencing. We'll get 148 different versions, but also it's a lot of extra cognitive weight over here's what I've installed at the stop. I know that it's got a hard surface. I know that I've put in a high curb. I know that I've put in tactile paving. So those kind of things you can tell us, and we go, okay, if it's got tactile paving, we know that it's going to be more accessible for our visually impaired users. So we'll tag it up as more accessible for them. Tactile paving doesn't matter to wheelchair people, to people in wheelchairs, but the high curb does. So if it's got a high curb, we'll infer its accessibility that way. So we've got a couple of different things we're looking at.
Are you getting that data? So you get the local authorities? Are you procuring that data, or
we're doing it in two ways, and that's what I was just going to get. Okay, so I'll talk about how we're doing the New Olympic, and I've got it all over here. So I'll talk about how we're doing the New Olympic in a moment.
I'll be quiet.
No, don't worry. It's a really good question. What we're also doing is we have one local authority that we're going to bring across its street furniture early, just to test all our coding and all our assumptions actually work. And then we'll go back to doing the New Olympic data. So there'll be one local authority that's sitting on street furniture. And that means that as other local authorities give us street furniture, we can create a pipeline and balance that out between the two different streams of work. Because getting data for 400,000 bus stops is quite a challenge. And this is what we're trying to do. So let's bring in the street furniture. we're working with data consumers, the journey planners, on ways we're presenting this data to them and how they're presenting that onwards to their passengers. And we're working with a number of user groups of passengers, but we're also working with those data consumers in the middle, and we also want to work with their passengers. So we're asking, as part of giving them nice early access and lots of feedback loops, that we can get involved when they talk with their user groups, that we can get involved with understanding what some of the feedback is, so we can adjust and adapt how we talk about it. And then later is bringing in rail and metro stations, because there's quite a bit of audit work to do that, and we're focusing on bus stops. But once we get rail in, we'll be able to do multimodal journeys.
Did RDG do a big bit of accessibility of their stations a while ago? Rail Delivery
They
Group?
did, and it's platform level, and we only have 3 platforms in NaPTAN.
Oh, okay. So you can get the platforms first and then do it that way.
I've got to audit my rail stations. I've got 76 from memory that need to be removed because they're now metro stations, or they're now defunct. Don't get me as to how many metro stations need to be removed. I've got a number to add. I've got a whole pile of tidying up. When we put in platforms, we'll be able to undo the chaos that is the 5. For example, Clapham Junction has 5 Clapham Junctions because they didn't code up the platforms, but they created 5 Clapham Junction stations. So we will have 1 Clapham Junction station that's got all the platforms. I was about to call it Wimblebum because it's a joke amongst our family. Wimbledon is very similar because it's got trams, it's got underground, it's got metro, and it's got trains. And it's got multiple train platforms and multiple tram platforms, which are accessed from the same
gantry.
That was the word I was looking for. So we want to code it up really well so people can see which platform they need to go to and what transport they're catching, because that's going to help people understand. Because one of the other access needs that we need to think about is cognitive, and thinking about making it very clear for people who can be easily confused due to neurospice, age, etc., just what you're catching at this platform, because that's also confusing. What we've found is, I think, and Lynn's going to tell me that she's got a couple, there are a couple of places where you can have a rail and a metro calling literally at the same station and at the same platform. So we want to make it really clear what you're catching and ensure that, and this is where the central management of both metro and rail is a little bit, because I want to figure out how we code that up so that Lynn can manage her metro stations and we can manage rail stations, but also not have 2 records for the same physical station, because that don't make sense. So there's a whole pile of tidying up. Yeah, Dan's like, and I'm like, don't even get started on entrances. Station entrances is a whole world of pain that we need to solve as well.
Yeah, I was thinking about like how the timetable data comes across from TfL, and for like tubes, for example, they just reference one stop no matter what direction they go in. So if you create,
and that's
issue.
Part of the problem. That's part of the problem because they only created one platform, not 2 platforms. So I want to work with them to get 2 platforms created, because they have the data that way round. They just combine it to send it out, because there's only one platform in NaPTAN. So I want to give them 2 platforms so they can separate the timing, because on their systems you can see the separate timing. On anyone else's systems you can't, and this is that siloing of information that's been unintentional. I don't think TfL's done it through anything other than the central team for some reason only gave them 1 platform, so they just worked around it.
It's a great idea, but it's a headache. I'm getting a headache thinking about it. So yeah, good luck.
Yeah. My life is spent kind of trying to plan how to do some of this stuff. So here's what we're doing. So we've got our street furniture, which is, and you can read through all the fine details and all the little questions. This is our street furniture data, which is not in our control of NaPTAN, but what we ask our data producers to give us. street furniture data. We also are creating new Olympic data. So this is a core data set that underlies everything that basically gets overwritten when we have street furniture data. We have found no audit data. When we've spoken to people about audits, we've managed to suggest, the few people who came to us for things around audits, we've suggested doing street furniture, and we've given them the Google form that we're using for New Olympic as an example of the level that we go down to. That's all pulled together into an inferred data set, which is called accessibility, which can be combined with NaPTAN for the data consumers. And they can then either show only journeys with accessible infrastructure to a user. So I can say, I need only electric wheelchair accessible journeys, or I can show a journey and show the infrastructure that's available on that chosen journey. I might have to choose a less than great journey and be aware that at this station I'm going to have a bad time. Or I need to find another option around this particular station. And the reason that there's the two options is it's about how the data consumers are looking, where they're looking to put it in the flow between their planning algorithm and their passenger presentation as to where they're putting in the accessibility. And it's all down to how their systems are built. And then passengers, Brenda can see plan on a journey planner, and there's a number of different kind of icons that I found in 2 minutes to kind of show there's different ways of showing that accessibility, and that's part of the innovation for journey planners, is how they build this in, which way round they build it in, how they build it in, and how they talk about it off to their passengers. There's the amount of information and the paucity of information currently. There isn't really a first mover advantage, so we're working in, I found a model on listening to a podcast from Freakonomics about collaborative competition or competitive collaboration, and it's a model around working together but still working in competition, still working with competing ideas and competing implementations, but still working to understand learnings that everyone's gotten from each other, and that's some of what we're trying to build. So data science bit, what are we doing to create the new Olympic data? Or why are we doing it? And I'll just run off to the side and show you. So a data set was created in 2010 and updated in 2016. It's referred to as the Olympic data because it was originally created for the 2012 Olympics. It was created with a different model of accessibility, very medicalized model, and has limited fields and uses. It has one field that says wheelchair, yes, no, or wheelchair, true, false, and another one that says assistance available, which for every bus stop is false. So it's just like, it was not that much use. So we want to create a baseline set for all bus stops in NaPTAN, which is about 400,000 stops. And we're going to infer this from the street furniture. Now, just very quickly, these two bus stops here are both marked, both active, and then in the Olympic data set, both were considered as wheelchair equals true. So this is trying to show that looking at the Olympic data set, this stop here is patently not somewhere where you would put a wheelchair user. You're going straight onto grass. That, I believe, is a bus shelter. I'm going to actually drive and find the stop next time I'm up that way to try to figure out what that is. It's on a B road. Hopefully I'm not going to risk my life doing that. There is a sign a bit further down. Here is a lovely bus stop in Luton that's got pretty much anything and everything you would want. It's got a high curb, it's got tactile paving, it's got a shelter, it's got a wide footpath, it's got a hard surface, everything that we're looking for. The one thing it doesn't have is a very good bus cage, but I'm not going to brick them on that. So our first MVP we've called hand cranking, because we're doing a lot of it simply by brute forcing and by hand cranking by the team. So every time we do something, we're doing it by hand, and then we're looking at what we can automate in the bits that we're doing. So the next time we do it, we might have a little script that does one part of it, or a bit more of it, or a bit more of it, and we're slowly building that up. So we were running on the hypothesis that trunk stops are most accessible. So we find our trunk stops. So we look up the number of buses per stop in a day. We plot them on a histogram and choose only the top stops. Everyone's like, how do you choose the top stops? And I'm like, it's really obvious. Most local authorities split into two very clear ends of the bands, because there are stops that only have 2 or 3 buses a day and stops that have like 300, over 300, I think is our record so far. We then look into the street furniture, and I'll open the Google form that we use. So this is the street furniture. So we put in the ACCO code, the date capture. So you can see there's little things that we could improve on this because we're having to manually put stuff in. We then take snapshots. We then also capture the Google map date that we're using, because sometimes you're needing to go back to remove traffic between you and the bus stop. So we just want to make sure that we're using a decent date. We then have a choice of the surface, permanent or soft, the tactile paving at the bus stop, and we even record what type of tactile paving. London seems to only use blister paving in the way that they use it. There is messages but behind all the different types of paving, tactile paving, that is in a standards document that is used quite differently across all the local authorities. I'm like, what a surprise. We then also have a look from the bus stop. Is there a controlled crossing that you can see from the bus stop? So we don't move from the bus stop, we just look up and down the street, and then we have a look at the different types. This is quite important, especially for our visually impaired users, knowing there's a controlled crossing nearby. We also have a look at curb cuts. So we spelt out what a curb cut was for everybody, and curb cuts often have tactile paving, so we record the tactile paving there as well. We also then look at the curb height. There's high curb, standard curb, and low no curb, so we mark it which it is. We know that most buses can use standard curb as well as high curb.
Quick question. So on the previous one you said about where you got the drop curb, are you going to say how far away that is from the stop?
Can you see it from the stop?
Can you see it from the stop?
So,
okay.
So everything is based on I'll just show you. I'll just choose one. Let's just go to Chesham because it's one of my favourite places. Just because it's a nice, easy one. If I go, I know where most of the bus stops are. So if I go to this bus stop down here, there we are. Based on this, I can say there's a controlled crossing of some sort there because there's a raised crossing. Is there a drop curb? Well, you've got a raised curb that takes you onto the same thing. There's probably a drop curb a little bit further up, but from here you could get down onto the roadway and continue on. If you look in the other direction, there's no controlled crossing this way. So you're literally just almost standing at the stop going, okay, what can I see? Well, I can see a standard curb, I can see a hard standing, I can see a bus stop, I can see a pole, I can see a flag. I can't see a real-time indicator, but I know that there is one because I know that bus stop. But we don't record it unless you can actually see it on the screen, because there's a second piece that we want to do. So there's a lot of just standing at the bus stop, having a look around. Is it, and you try not to move.
I guess the issue is with Google map data, well, I guess you've got the licensing sorted and that's okay. But the secondary thing is some areas haven't been updated since 2017 and things like that.
This is part of why we're keeping track of where where things are, just so that we understand what's there, and then we also mark up everything that we can see. Real-time displays, static timetables, shelter, cycle lane. The cycle lane, especially if there's a floating cycle lane behind the bus stop that you have to cross to continue your journey. Footway width, clearway, advertising. Now, this sounds weird. Your trunks are where the people are, their eyeballs, where their eyeballs, they're advertising. So one of our things is we believe that we've found trunks when we see advertising. So it's like a little double check. One of the things that we might do from a local authority that maybe doesn't have full street furniture data may be able to tell us which bus stops have advertising on. So we can then quickly just double check those trunks. So it's kind of like a nice little double check, bus pole or flag and the road markings. We've called them road markings, not bus cages, just because it was clearer for the team, and then any notes. So that's what we fill out for every single stop that we look at. And then using that, we infer accessibility. So for a user type mobility, we have true. We've looked at the street furniture, probably true. It's in the same group. It's in those high frequencies, but we've not directly looked at it. False, we've looked at the street furniture and it's not accessible. And null, we've got no information. And then we publish the data to consumers, who can then publish it to passengers. So that's the bit that we're running through now. The next thing we're going to run through, version 2, and we're just having a look at what the cost and how we would do that. We still find our trunks, so we're only looking at those high frequency stops, and we are going to use an AI to look at the street furniture rather than a human, because it's not asking it to make any inferences. It's just saying, can you see this? Can you see this? Can you see this? So we're building some training data sets. Dan looks slightly worried about that. We're going to do lots of dropouts. If it's unsure, it drops to a human, all of those things.
Okay.
We know that there's a big dependency on the stop being located correctly in Google Maps. We believe for the trunks, hypothesis 2, locations are better on trunks and in urban areas than for the rural ones. We know the rural ones, little car with camera on be speeding past, so the bus stop can move quite dramatically as to where it's recorded, and you also end up with those half a post weird things going on. So that's the next piece that we're working on. What does probably true mean? So this is a measure we're going to use in the new Olympic data to indicate a stop that meets the following. It's a marked stop, so BST marked or BCT marked. It has a physical presence on the street and is active, is in use. So we're only looking at active stop. If it's marked as inactive, we're not including it in this at the moment, because we're trying to reduce people's eyeballs, but also the AI spend, because even if it's only a small percentage of a cent, by the time you hit your 400,000 mark, that's quite a lot of money that you can easily throw on some AI experiment. So we're trying to be really parsimonious on how we do this. It's a marked active stop, and it's within the high frequency group for this local authority. So we know that it's having a lot of traffic, and it's not been assessed by the team directly. So we know that it's very likely to have stops. So how probable is probable? We're looking at a cutoff of 80% when we check the high frequency stops. If we're above this threshold within our 3 iterations, we try to find the lowest point within our 3 runs. If not, we just go, okay, so we're well above it. We know everything in this group is above that 80% mark. We've tested enough of them. Now, why 80%? I play Dungeons and Dragons a lot. That's the reason why it's very hard to roll 2 natural ones in a row. It's a 4% chance. But let me reverse that around. If there are 2 stops in a row, both 80% probable, and the passenger will disembark at the first accessible stop they come to, the probability of them to be able to get off at one of the 2 stops is 96%. Because if they can get off at the first stop, there's an 80% chance. So there's a 20% chance they go to the next stop, and at the next stop, there's an 80% chance that they can get off, which means there's a 16% chance. 80 plus 16 is 96%. It's very unlikely. There's a 4% chance that they will not be able to disembark. So we're explaining it this way to people. It seems to be understandable. Most people can get the sort of probability. I get people to play with dice, D20 dice, to do this, because if you roll a natural 1, you can't hop off the stop. You roll it again, you're very unlikely to roll 2 natural 1s in a row. For those who play D&D, showing that I am truly the geekiest of geeks. So how do we combine this into a schema? This is where Dan's like, oh, show me the schema. So we're proposing as a schema for the first set of data, and this will change and expand. We're going to start working on an AAA WCAG model for describing the level of accessibility for that group. So there might be mobility AAA, and visual AAA. I noticed that I've made some spelling mistakes today, and I'll fix it up later because I haven't put the AAAs in. And we're also probably looking at cognitive as well. So we're trying to figure out exactly where those levels are by working with users as to what we know what an A is because we know the things you must have. Then it's like, what are the things that would make the stop even better? And for some people with mobility, it's a shelter, and for some people it's a shelter with seats. So it's kind of like, how do we code those? How do we build that up? So then we've got across here, so I've tried to represent how the data will look. Across here is the shorthand value of the stop that we're using. So we've got nod true, which is probably true, nod false, nod null, local authority true, local authority false, and LA low, null. Then the schema field. So we've got mobility accessible, which is true, false, or null. So we've got this stop is accessible for a mobility person. It's not accessible. We have no information. And then we've got the mobility level of accessibility. We've got an A, a null, A, AA, AAA, and then nulls. Now, AA and AAA will only be available from local authority. We're not going to put it in from the nod data because we can't validate and verify, and we've got no double check that that's actually physically there. It could be a hallucination by an AI, or it could be a hallucination, or the stop has changed dramatically. One of the things we're uncovering is stops don't tend to go backwards in their accessibility. If you've put stuff in, you tend to keep it in there. Sometimes needs a bit of repair, but you're never ripping things out. Taking out a bus stop is almost as expensive as putting one in. Or a bus shelter, so you don't tend to rip out bus shelters, for example. So that's how we're using the AA, AAA. The certainty, this is where you'll understand how we've done it. So it's true, we've definitely seen this. Probably true, it's within that same group. False, we've definitely seen it, and it's not accessible. And null, we have no information. And then we're putting in the provenance of the street furniture data. So GSV is Google Street View. Probable means that we've done this by it's part of the probable group. We haven't directly seen it, but it's part of that probable group, Google Street View. When we go to AI, this probable will disappear because we're going to look at all of the high frequency stops using AI. So there'll be an AI marker and then local authority marker. And then the data source will be either New Olympic data or local authority. So we've tried to spell this out, and then there'll be mobility visual will be true, false, or null for showing if the stop has all the accessibility features for anyone who has visual impairment. And possibly the same, and then building on the same for cognitive of what somebody needs to recognize a stop as a bus stop, which is kind of some of the stuff that we're starting to look at. Does anyone have any feedback, red flags, green flags on that at the moment? I know it might almost seem like we're slightly over-engineering, but we want to make sure that it's really, really clear where the data comes from, how it's and what those inferences are.
So obviously we're going to use the LA. It'd be the best source of truth as opposed to the Google Street View kind of nod stuff. Yeah. How will this look in the export then? Like, so we're saying this is a schema. So if would we get these as different entries, or would it be one entry for each of these? If we get
so
the first is mobility, true or false, we would just get a true or false, and a true true would mean not true, or it would be LA true, but they'd both be shown as true. Is that kind of input?
Yeah. So you take true and then nod. So all of these fields would
So if you
come
look down at the
down.
bottom, got you.
Yeah.
So the
So
data
all
source
of
would
these
show.
fields will come together, and you're able to go, okay, I understand it. Once one of the reasons for bringing in one bit of LA furniture early is so that we can find the problems on this part of the schema before we get too far down the line of what it looks like for Dan when we have that mixture of nod and local authority street furniture. The reason for doing the nod, and let's be honest, the chances of me getting 148 local authorities to give me street furniture data was precisely zero.
Yeah.
The chances of me being able to build a nod database that covers the country, all 148 local authorities, minus the 4 central ones, but hey, I use 148 as the number for all 148 local authorities. I knew that I could do that probably within about 18 months. That's kind of the time frame that we're working towards, of getting that data set built that is really validated, really hardcore, and done in a systematic, repeatable way, so that if somebody says, how did you do this? We can show them how they did it. They should be able to go off and do it, run the same inferences. We're going to publish everything, run the same inferences, run the same scripts, and be able to go, oh yes, I can see how you've arrived at that data, and I see the same thing. We also didn't want to give Lynn and everyone at a local authority go out and fill out this horrendous form. It's not the most wonderful form for every single stop on your system, because that's such an extra weight that isn't really it's going to help, but it's such an extra weight to get this going. We'd never get the funding to get it done. So this was a way of kind of balancing out, doing it automatically, using data that we can get, and then allowing a system where local authorities can upgrade that data and take control of that data as they come on board. So, for example, the first local authority that comes on board, LA data overwrites, or doesn't overwrite, it overrules nod data.
Yep.
Because it's valid, it's coming from the source.
Yeah,
and if Lynn then goes out and updates and has provided it, and then updates 20 stops, they can give us that data for 20 stops. We will ingest it and redo the inferences so that the accessibility of those 20 stops that have been upgraded can be upgraded within the system. So Lynn doesn't have to do a lot of extra work. Our system will automatically do all the inferences. So one of the things for a stick user like myself is seating in a bus stop. Because if I have to wait 15 minutes for a bus, standing for 15 minutes is pretty hardcore. I'd like to sit down. It's knowing which of the 2 bus stops to choose from, which one's got a seat or has seating. I may not be able to get a seat because there are people there, but has seating is something that will allow me to have that agency and autonomy over which stop I walk to and how I wait for a bus. So it's all those little things that we just want to be able to bring in, because that could be a double A for somebody of there's a seat at this bus. But we would never show it unless Lynn told us this is a bus shelter with seating in, because you can't see that clearly from a lot of the Google Street Views, because bus stops are turned the other way round. They may be lit, they may be unlit. One of the other ones that we're looking at potentially, as well as cognitive, is things like looking at the busyness of the bus stop. Is it safe to use at particular times of day? So I have bus stops around by me and walking routes home that I don't use after dark, because it takes me through a park that is a lovely park, but is very dodgy after dark. But that, again, that's local knowledge, and it's allowing somebody to have that knowledge of this is a good bus stop after dark. This is a bus stop. You might want to choose the other bus stop and walk, or catch a cab for that last 10-minute walk type thing at this particular time of night. It's being aware of and not making judgments about areas as well, but it's giving people that indicator of safety or comfort or something. Somebody else pointed out when I said, it would be really good to have lights at bus shelters. She pointed out that on a very rural road, if you're a single woman waiting at a bus shelter, you don't want to be visible as a single woman waiting at a bus shelter, and you don't want the light to be on. So I was like, oh, that's a really interesting nuance that I hadn't thought about. So it's very, very much thinking about those things and making it clear what there is at that bus shelter, so somebody knows the situation that they're going to be waiting in.
Okay.
And those kind of things, which is important. And but this is all those extra layers that we can start once we've got that core piece of nod in. We can actually start to code some of this up and do these inferences. Lynn, I saw you nodding on some of those, so I'm guessing it makes sense. Dan, I'm happy to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I've got a couple. So mobility, and we're going to be mobility by an AA, AAA kind of things. Is it worthwhile splitting out mobility and visual impairment as different entries as part of the schema? Is that what we're going to be doing?
It is. So there'll be mobility. So this is the first version, which, because we're only looking at mobility now, there'll be a second, essentially would be in visual accessible, true, false, and then visual level would be a string as well. So those two fields would be repeated for other accessibility groupings, if we want to call them that way.
Okay, great. And then another thing, so floating bus stops in London. I think I emailed you about this previously, Dr. J, and I've got a friend that works in the Guide Dogs Association or something like that, and they hate the idea of floating bus stops because you're suddenly making vulnerable users having to cross a lane of cycle traffic.
Absolutely.
How would you
London
handle
cyclists?
I'm not going to say anything about London cyclists, but yeah, how would you handle that in this information, do we think?
So what we're going to do is that will be a negative marker against a bus stop. So if it's got a floating bus stop behind, we may pull it down from a AA to an A, or from an A to a not accessible. So we want to, from an A to a false. But we want to work with blind users to understand, do we do a third line that says floating bus stop? And that's just an extra one. But like I said, this is why throughout the private beta the schema will change, because we'll start to build more things on. At the moment, we're literally just working on the inferences for a user in a wheelchair, not even an electric wheelchair. We're combining all of the wheelchairs together into a wheelchair. We know that there's some really big differences that we've got to be aware of there, and we'll pull those out at the next level. So there might be in mobility electric, in mobility or level. We want to look at the right wording to use and things like that to give you the ability to say, oh, this is about that extra special stuff for an electric wheelchair, because they have, even though they cost an awful lot more, they have a lot more sensitivity to the steepness of ramps and to gaps than a manual wheelchair. A manual wheelchair user can often bounce over things that an electric wheelchair user can't. But it depends on the manual wheelchair, and that's one of the things that we want to find the right wording, because it's not about the wheelchair, it's about the user and their ability, or how the wheelchair is propelled. It's about the user and the tolerance of that particular system for slopes and gaps. The stuff I'm having to learn about. I have become. I thought, oh, I've learned all about NaPTAN. I will just become an expert on buses. No, I've become an expert on the gaps for wheelchairs and the types of tactile pavings that exist in London.
I think it's one more thing. So
Sorry.
I think I said this before, so I think I linked you up with. So Ordnance Survey are looking for ways in which to spend the Cabinet Office's money to do new mapping of things. I think this is a good example of something that you might be able to lean on them as opposed to Google.
We are talking with them. Google is one of the data consumers that we're working with. So we're actually building a nice little virtuous relationship directly with Google as well on this. So there's a little bit there. Ordnance Survey don't have the Street View, don't have some of the stuff that we need to make this work. So we do want to work with them to make the mapping more precise, accurately and precisely, because we want it to be a 1 metre by 1 metre square where you stand to catch the bus, not where the flag is, because that's usually co-located, but sometimes they're not. But it's where you stand to catch the bus, and that will make it so much easier for people who are blind, visually impaired, especially, and cognitively need cognitive assistance as well, because knowing where to stand at a bus stop is really important. And it might only be a matter of a couple of meters, but it makes such a difference to your comfort level of knowing you've signaled to the right bus at the right place to stand, especially when there's multiple lanes. Those multiple bus stops are really hard, but then they're going to be really hard to code up as well.
And I guess also, if you're going to be doing this kind of analysis, are you able to split that out as a feature type against a stop? So this stop is covered. This stop has real-time information. This stop has as essential.
We're bringing that into the AAA. So that's part of what we're inferring in. So we will have that information and we can infer it in. What we don't want to do is overwhelm people with information, but we will be clear of, if it's an A, here's the stuff that, if it's A for mobility, here's the stuff that it has. If it's AA for mobility, here's the stuff that it has. Rather than giving you the detail for every stop, because that's too much reading for Brenda. Brenda just wants to know, can she use the stop?
Yes, it's too much. It's too much for Brenda, but me as a data person, I can then, if I've got that raw data, I love raw data, because then I can do infers for Brenda itself. So actually say,
absolutely.
Hey, look, it's an A, it's a AAA, but actually, if you want to say, well, what does this stop have? You can click on it. So this stop, almost like a tick box that you get them at.
This stuff has this because it's AA.
I've got a cash machine. I've got a thing, all that kind of stuff. It'd be great to have that against the stop.
Yeah, so having the A, the AA, we will always tell you what's included in an A and a AA, and they won't be scored as a AA unless you've got everything on the list. Okay. So it's one of those things of, very much like WCAG, you don't get that grading until you've got everything of that grading, and then you're a AA site or a AAA site, if that makes sense. So it's giving you the information, but just reducing it down so you're not having to parse this information for every single stop.
Okay.
Cool. Lynn, before we've got about 20 minutes left, do you have any thoughts, questions?
The only thing that came into my mind when you were talking about the air that is an area safe overnight and stuff, you could argue that no area is safe, couldn't you? Really? that's what I was
take back the streets. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes. Having just walked through the back end of Holland Park last night after an opera and discovering just how dark and inaccessible just those particular London streets, because people want fancy pants streetlights that don't actually light up the street, but they look very pretty on those very posh streets. How not safe it felt. Yeah, I kind of agree, but it's also trying to indicate. So on some, I'm sure she's done it on a colleague has often talked about their favourite bus stop is a very busy bus stop that's busy 24/7, because they feel safe going there after a night out and catching the bus home, because they know that it's going to be well populated by people. They know that there's always going to be, it's going to be well lit. There's always going to be foot traffic around, so they feel much safer than being in an isolated bus stop. And that's something that we can show. This stop is busy. This stop is not busy, and there's information that we could grab for that. That is many layers down the line on NOD and our local authority pieces. Like, we're currently just trying to take that MVP baby step of going, does it have a curb? I mean, literally, we were for A for mobility. It's, does it have a curb? So it's a medium or high curb. Does it have a hard surface? So it's concrete or or paving. Does it have a wide footway? So is the footway width wide, and I might just be those three, or there could be one other. I think it could just be those three are what we're working on for that first inference. And even then, we've got some that cover two, but not all three. So the footway width is where a lot of, especially some of the London stops get caught out, because their footway is quite narrow outside of zone 1 or zone 2. So you end up with this very narrow footway, and you could put a ramp down and you could come down off the ramp, but you go straight into a hedge. You'd not actually be able to get off the bus in a safe way at that particular stop. So it's identifying those. So even though those three things sound really, really simple, they're actually pulling out stops and going, actually, this stop, the footway's not wide enough. You couldn't come off there and get a wheelchair off. And I uncovered how much room is needed by my YouTube is wrecked, by watching a YouTube of a disabled traveller who was having a trouble with a train because the carriage that they were to get on, and they can't transfer between carriages because it's not even enough. The carriage that they were to get on, if the ramp came down, there was a pole in the way, and the train driver needed to move the train about 10 metres. Just needed to move the train, like turn it on, move very slightly, turn it off. And there was a huge hour-long standoff between the train driver, the passenger, and the conductor, and the train manager as to whether that was possible or not. And I'm just like mind blown. And this is the stuff that I'm really starting to understand, the advantages that I've got as a stick user over anyone who's needing to have that step-free access, who can't. I mean, I struggle to step up onto trains. When I'm having a bad day, I will need help. I'll need somebody to give me a bit of a hand to get onto a train, but I don't need a ramp. And just that small difference makes such a difference at so many different places. And that also led me to think about, if you come off a bus and the bus, where the bus has parked and the ramp comes down, goes straight into a phone pole or something, the bus driver often, and you'll see it in London occasionally, the bus driver will have a look and then just move the bus a metre or so forward and then put the ramp down, so there's at least somewhere that somebody can disembark. But you've got to have a certain footway width to disembark from a ramp, because you can't just jump off the side. You've got to go all the way off it and turn. And that's these are all the things that we're just trying to understand. Dan's got that look of how on earth are you doing this?
No,
I'm
so Ordnance Survey have just done, I've just been the beta data path widths. So they've got all the path width data. They've surveyed all that from there for imagery and things like that. So they know the path widths. And they've also just done street lights as well. And that's coming out, I think, in March or April next year. So them two things could be good indicators that you could utilise as well.
And we can bring in and add into with our Google Street View, because one of the hard things for us is looking at a bus stop. I'll just grab another one in Chesham. I'll just go, one of these ones might be interesting. See what their footway is like. So here we have a bus stop that's very definitely not accessible. I'm loving that. But across the road, no, it's not across the road. It must be the other way around. Sorry, I'm really bad. Here we are. So here's one. So that's a wide enough footpath, because it's a double wide. But if you get ones that are the single wide footpath, like this one here, I bet you is single wide. Yeah, that single wide footpath is too narrow to drop a ramp and have, heavens only knows where the bus stop is. There'll be a marking on a pole somewhere that I've missed. But that footway is too narrow to have somebody, and this is before you've got the parked car rubbish bin problem. Wheelie bin problems. There's some parts, my friend during lockdown, I met somebody in Chesham, and just trying to walk along parts of the street around some of the areas where you've got hedges and cars and wheelie bins, I had to give up and walk in the road because I don't have. I've got. I'm an 8-bit. I'm an 8-bit character. I can only go forward and back. I can't. I've got to turn sideways. I can't do a sidestep very easily, and that was one of the funs of trying to get me around those. It was kind of like watching a very slow 8-bit character. I'll just go, oh sod it, I'll just walk down the middle of the road and take my life into my hands to get round the cars because it's the only way to get around. And I can totally understand anyone with more mobility access needs. I won't say more mobility access needs, tackling these sorts of roads and these sorts of problems. It's a real difficulty. But that one there that I just looked at, that would be a branch, because I bet you that particular stop. And how do we do this? We had a look at. Scroll down here. See departure board. We used this departure board as our very first. We did this as just a visual check, and we would go and have a look, and we go, there's not very many buses stopping at the stoplight. This one's the next day, so there's only 4 buses a day maybe. So that's very much a branch rather than a trunk. Whereas if we have a look down at something like here, we'll probably find, see departure board. It's a little bit busier, not by much. So even for us, that could be a branch, but it all depends on the local authority, because there are some stops. And we would just say, okay, full departure board. It's more than 10. You can see the difference between the trunks and the branches quite easily. Yeah. Dan's like,
I'm just laughing at the name 1B, the one. It's just one, the one, 1A, the one.
Yeah. It's all branding. I just find it. I think. Oh, so here's an interesting sidestep in the last 5 minutes. I'll just run back to here, and actually I'll stop sharing. Lynn, franchising.
I've actually had one of my friend's cousins contact me because she works for Liverpool, and they're about 5 months ahead of us. And she wants to chat with me because she's only just started working for the authority for about 6 months. And she's like, I want to pick your brains on franchising. And I went, well, I think you're a bit further ahead than we are, because I think the meeting may have been yesterday on the decision as to whether we're doing it or not. So yeah, we haven't had I haven't heard anything yet. I might have missed it, but it's going to be a while off. But yeah,
it's one of the things, and this is why I'm trying to ensure that NaPTAN is in a good state, because I also know one of the interesting side effects from doing the frequency histogram is we can get you a list of the active bus stops that don't have any services running through them. So because for the non-franchised areas, I'm figuring that this might actually be a really good piece of information, or even just being able to give you that histogram of here's your plot of stops. But by the way, here's all the stops that have zero services running through them that we're picking up from TransExchange. So we're using BODS and the Transport API, where BODS has not got all of the data. So for Scotland, Wales, we're using the Transport API a few times. For most of the time, we're using BODS. So if it's not published on BODS, we figure it's not a bus. And we're looking for all of those stops that we've got that are active, that you've put in, that nobody's putting bus services through. Because we figure when people start to look at their franchising and how the franchising should work, those are the stops that are really, really interesting in that conversation, as well as to why are these stops being underserved or not served at all.
We've got that list because we when we do the TNDS, we load in all the trans exchange data for the whole country, and we load in all the NaPTAN data, and then we see all the stops that aren't utilised, and then on the other side we see all the stops that are referenced that don't exist as well, and then they're the bigger concerns when an operator's reference and NaPTAN stop doesn't exist. But on the other side we see all the unused stops in the country, which is there's quite a lot actually.
Yeah. So one of the things that we're looking at with local authorities is how useful is that data, and what's the easiest ways for us to provide it, because for some people it's not going to be useful because they're not in that franchising conversations yet, but for some people it's like, oh yes, that's really going to be useful for us to be able to kind of grab it, and we get it as a side outcome to one of the steps that we run, and I'm like, oh, this is actually useful. So I'm getting the team just to store the data, and we can just spit it out whenever somebody wants. And then if people do start wanting it, it's going to be one of those things of how do we publish this nice and easily, because this finding the trunks is actually took us quite a bit of time to get correct, Dan, and I'm sure Dan understands why, because we were trying to also combine BODs and the TNDS data to make sure that we were definitively getting all of the services that ran through a stop at a particular time. We also tried NextBus API, but that only works from the time of day for, I think it's 24 hours. And that was leading to some wild variations of stops in the middle of the night and things like that. Different. The fun of it all. So is there anything else? Has this been useful, Lynn and Dan, today?
Really useful. Yeah,
it's been good.
Excellent. On the back end of the mural, there's a little feedback corner. If you get 5 minutes, just have a look through it. It lets me know what's working and what's not, and what I can adjust in these public meetings, because I want them all to be really, really useful and good. So I'm just going to thank you both for your time and your energy. I've really appreciated it, and I am going to stop recording. Yay!